to actually tell her that he's being kidnapped. And in the background, she heard the younger one, who's 12 years old, shouting, don't take me, I'm too young, I'm sorry.
In other news, ex-Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone won't go to jail for not telling the taxman about a £400 million trust fund. The 92-year-old has to repay $650 million and was handed a 17-month suspended sentence. And the remains of the iconic Sycamore Gap tree are being removed piece by piece from near Hadrian's Wall in Northumbria. It was felled last month in what's been described as a deliberate act of vandalism. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 25 points at 76.45. The pound buys $1.22 and €1.16. LBC weather, rain affecting much of England and Wales tonight. Showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland with a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
8:05 on LBC. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. Now, let's, on a Thursday night, as you know, I like to have one person doing an interview and then answering calls from listeners. Well, tonight, it's not going to be an exception tonight, but it is going to be a little bit different because I think there are all sorts of foreign relations aspects to this crisis in the Middle East, military aspects, which, frankly, those of us who are not foreign affairs analysts or military experts struggle to understand. So who better to join us tonight than Michael Clarke, Defence and Foreign Affairs analyst, who's former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. I remember when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, we had him in for a couple of hours and it was a real education. I think that's what we're going to get hopefully over the next hour. Michael, thank you for joining us again. I've got lots of questions already coming in, but just tell me from where you think we are in this. We're 5 days on from the initial attacks and murders on Saturday. I think the international community has become a lot more vocal over the past 24, 48 hours in some interesting ways, I think. But what about the military situation as well? Because I think some of us had expected Israel to launch a land invasion of Gaza by now, but they haven't. Just take us through it from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly are going to launch a land invasion. I mean, nobody's told me that, but I would put my reputation on it. And it takes a bit longer to organise because they're going to break in from several points at once. And there's all sorts of reasons of doing that. They're not going to go in one or two places. I'm sure they'll go in on the land side in several places and from the seaward side as well. And that takes a little bit of time to organise. Also, they may be holding back a little bit because of the hostages, because it may be that they think that there's a chance, however remote, of using this blockade of Gaza, which is absolutely brutal and will be causing deaths of the old and the young and the vulnerable by early next week. So they may try to use that to get some or proportion of the hostages out by peaceful means. But they won't be deterred by the hostage issue from moving in. And the fact that they've called up now 360,000 troops is not they're not going to use all those 360,000 in Gaza, but they'll need them for the Lebanon front, for the West Bank, and for the fact that they are preparing now for what could be actually a long war, not a few weeks or a couple of months, but deep into next year. So that's where we are with it. The military situation is very delicately poised, as it were, in awfulness. I'd be very surprised if this invasion isn't taking place by this time next week. I think we're only a matter of days away from it. And the international community, as you said, is now trying to keep this contained to Gaza because there's every reason why this may not stay in Gaza and might become a more generalized war across parts of the Middle East. And that's the nightmare for everybody. So as bad as this is, and it really is bad as far as Gaza and Israel goes, it could get even worse. And that's where we are tonight.
In terms of intelligence, obviously there's a massive failure of intelligence. Nobody seemed to foresee this happening. And Israeli intelligence services, I think you'll agree, have probably got a very good reputation, but they've singularly failed here, it seems. I'm sure there'll be lots of inquiries going into that. Yeah. But of course, they still have a function now, don't they? Because one of the main aims, I imagine, of the Israeli government is to locate the 150 hostages. So they can avoid hitting any of the buildings that they're in, and B, to try to rescue them. To what extent does Israeli intelligence sort of infiltrate Gaza? I mean, have they got people there giving them intelligence, do you think?
Oh, well, they certainly have had in the past. I mean, we can talk about the intelligence failure of all of this because it is a systemic failure. But the Israeli intelligence has always been very good: electronic intelligence, signals intelligence, but also, as they call, human intelligence. And they've always had a lot of people working for them on the West Bank, in the occupied territories, and in Gaza. And of course, those people work for them for a variety of reasons: some out of commitment, some because they're blackmailed into it, some because they're bought off, some because they're facing long prison sentences in Israel, and the way to get out of it is to agree to work for the Israelis for a while, and then the sentence won't be implemented. All sorts of reasons. But the Israelis have always had good human intelligence, which in this case has completely failed. And they will be working very hard to try to reignite those human intelligence networks, and also find out as much as they can from aerial intelligence and from what they're getting from the United States, and probably from Britain as well. I mean, we've said that we're helping. We have a very powerful intelligence outlet at Cyprus, Mount Olympus in Cyprus, which does a lot of listening over the Middle East. And we're now deploying, as of tonight, or starting tomorrow, a P-8 Poseidon aircraft is going to be flying up and down, and that listens to telephone conversations. It's been doing it in Ukraine. It's what it's designed to do. It can do all sorts of other things. But literally, the Israelis with Britain and America will be working very, very hard to try to locate as many of the hostages as they possibly can. But if they've located them, that's still only part of the problem. Somehow they've then got to try to rescue them or prevent them being killed, or somehow insulate where they are from the operation that's going to take place next week.
William Hague wrote a very interesting article in the Times a couple of days ago. I don't know if you read it, but it was basically warning Israel not to fall into the trap that they've fallen into in the past, where they have had public opinion on their side, then they've gone in all guns blazing, and public opinion, or world public opinion, has then deserted them. Yeah. How can they avoid this happening again?
They can't avoid it, and they know it's going to happen. They've just got to work on it very quickly. They have a thing called the victory doctrine, or the doctrine of victory, which is that they've got to do this fast, because they know that as soon as things start to get even worse in Gaza, that world opinion will go against them, and they settle for that. And so they know that they've got to get this over quickly. The idea of standing off for a month and trying to negotiate or talk about a mediation process, they won't even entertain that. They said, we've got to finish this now ourselves, and the faster we finish it, the more the world will get used to the fact that we had no alternative. And so what they're saying is that they know this is a miserable situation. I mean, Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, said, I think it was this morning. Yeah, it was this morning. He said that, the danger is that Israel is actually doing what Hamas wants. It's always a bad idea to do what your enemy wants you to do. And at the moment, Israel is cooperating with Hamas in the sense that Hamas wanted to be outrageous, to so outrage the Israelis that they would overreact. That's what William Hague was talking about. And at the moment, the Israelis are in a position where they look as if they might overreact, in the sense that, yes, a lot of people agree that this is probably the moment to try to dismantle Hamas, but to do so, you've got to stick to the laws of war, and that's very, very difficult in Gaza in the best of circumstances, let alone these circumstances. And so the Israelis have said, I mean, the Prime Minister's office has made the point. They said restraints are now off. I don't know quite what that means, but it's an ominous thing to come out of a prime ministerial office. The restraints are off. But below that is this sense that the Israelis say, we don't know where this road leads. We just don't. But after last Saturday, we've got no choice but to go there. We've got to go down this road. We have no choice, is what they say.
That's the point I was trying to make to Rachel Shabby at the end of the last hour, where I said, well, I understand why you condemn the military strikes on Gaza. I understand why you condemn the blockade. But if you were the Israeli Prime Minister, what alternative have you got apart from doing those things?
Yes. And what the world is saying certainly the Western world is saying to the Israelis, yeah, we understand that, but you're going to have to do this in a way that doesn't undermine your civilized values. You've got to do this in a way that sticks to the laws of war. And of course, against that, the fact is the Israelis have, in lots of ways, have brought this on themselves over the last 20 odd years because of the structure of the way they've operated at Gaza since they withdrew from 2005. and what's happened on the West Bank with, 250 illegal settlements and so on and so forth. We can argue about that, and you get a blizzard of abuse even just saying it live on the radio. But
Tell
it's
me
the
about
truth.
it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you and I both. So, we know we get a blizzard of abuse just for mentioning those things, but they're straight facts. They're facts of life. And so, in one sense, Israel has created the structural violence that has led to this particular violence. And this particular violence is completely and utterly unacceptable. It is absolute terrorism. But there they are. I mean, the dilemma that we're just talking about, the dilemma of what else can the Israelis do, in a sense, they've walked themselves into this blind alley over a number of years. And now I feel great sympathy for decision makers in Jerusalem now, because if I was in that position, I'm not sure what I would do either. I wouldn't find a way out of this. So they're going to go forward. I wish them well in the task of taking down Hamas, because Hamas are miserable. I mean, they are incompetent. They're hopeless. They don't care about anybody but themselves and their battle. They don't do anything for the Gazans. They haven't been elected since 2007 was the last election. They are firm believers in one man, one vote, once only, and that's what they do. And so the world will be a better place without Hamas. But what's going to happen next will be absolutely brutal, and it will be very hard to take for those of us watching from the outside.
We've got lots of questions coming in. If you'd like to add to them, 0345 6060 973. We are streaming this hour on Global Player as well, if you'd like to watch us as well. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
8 on LBC. Michael Clarke is with us, Defence and Foreign Affairs Analyst, former Director General of RUSI. Lots and lots of calls coming in, so let's go straight to them. Remy's in Chadwell Heath. Hello, Remy.
Hi.
Hi, what would you like to say?
So basically, I just wanted to ask about, I didn't see the point about us sending another warship to join the American warship in that region of the world. I'm wondering, what is that going to achieve? Already, the response from the Israeli side has been so disproportionate, in my opinion anyway, with the number of people killed, bearing in mind the demographics in Gaza, with 40% of people, for example, being children. So I just think, look, already, the Israeli army, the IDF, is most powerful in the whole world already. It's already got such might, such capability. What are we going to further achieve by sending our warships and the Americans sending the world's largest aircraft carrier? What are we trying to achieve? What can the IDF do more with that support compared to what it already can?
I suspect it's rather symbolic, but I'm not the expert. Michael Clarke is. Michael, how do you answer Remy's question? It's a good question.
He's absolutely right. And I promise you, Remy, that there's nothing to do with Britain joining the war in any in any tangible way like that, in the way that you were thinking about. But Ian's right. It's symbolic. It's a way of expressing support for Israel and standing with the United States. We always like to say that, well, when the US is involved, we can get involved as well. But there's a practical side to it too, because if you've got a couple of warships and there's a company of Marines on board, which is 100 odd Royal Marines, they can do lots of other useful things. So it may be that the evacuation of British nationals, it may be that people, British nationals in Lebanon, they've been evacuated before in previous crises, and you've got to evacuate them from the sea if Beirut is closed. In a volatile situation, there may be all sorts of things where Britain's legitimate interests are endangered. And if you've got a couple of warships with all of the air power that they can produce, plus some Marines, you can do useful things, and you can deliver humanitarian aid. Remember that we use Cyprus. If there's humanitarian aid, can be assembled in Cyprus. It can be got from Cyprus to the area of Gaza pretty easily. There's a seaward side. There's a big Mediterranean coast along Gaza. So there's lots of practical things that warships can do, as well as Ian said, creating a symbol of presence.
And presumably there will be British citizens in Gaza who probably would quite like to get out, and at some point that might be another avenue for them to get out. So,
yes,
I don't know how you get onto a warship from the Gaza coast.
Hamza Yousaf's in-laws are there. His two in-laws are there. The Scottish First Minister, and there's at least two others that we know of. There will be a handful of people with family connections who are in Gaza, and it may be that there will be an opportunity to send some landing craft into the beaches of Gaza and get people out to the ships waiting offshore that can take them to safety. That we're not at that point yet, but it's plausible.
Remy, thank you for that. Here's a good text question from Mohammed, who says, how similar or different are Hamas and Daesh in origin, nature and methodology?
Yeah, I mean, quite different in the sense that, they're both Sunni Muslim. So they both have that element of thinking about the way they think about martyrdom and the way they think about the jihad, which is the way differently to the way Shia Muslims tend to think about jihad. I mean, violent jihad we're talking about now. In organizational terms, Hamas have been around rather longer. Islamic State, ISIS, arose really literally out of the Iraq war itself. I mean, Hamas goes back to the 1980s, whereas Daesh really were created out of the northern provinces of Iraq, and a lot of Daesh was led by old Iraqi officers, the sort of disenfranchised Iraqi officers who were completely fed up with everything. Became the organizers of Daesh, and Daesh tried to create this caliphate. They tried to create a working state between parts of Iraq and parts of Syria, northern Iraq and parts of Syria, which was dismantled by the Allies in 2019. But now Daesh have gone off to be rather like Al Qaeda. They've gone into Sinai, they've gone into Libya. They're into other parts of the Sahel in Africa. They're in Afghanistan. They've dispersed just the way Al Qaeda have dispersed. The thing about Hamas is that they don't exist anywhere else. Hamas are just the group who control Gaza, and Hamas are Palestinian, and they are focused on the destruction of Israel, whereas Daesh are focused ideologically on creating the global caliphate. I suspect that Hamas would find that slightly awkward, and certainly wouldn't, I don't think, integrate that into their thinking, because Hamas are a very specific regional organization trying to accomplish something in only that part of the Middle East.
But if they combined up with Hezbollah in the north, basically in Lebanon, if Hezbollah decided to do something in the north, you'd have the Israelis effectively fighting on two fronts. And the Iranians, I mean, they're obviously involved to a degree already. I suspect that would be that would increase their involvement. Would you agree with that?
It would. Yeah, I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah haven't exactly been at daggers drawn, but there's lots of differences between them over the years. I mean, they took opposite sides during the Syrian civil war, for instance, and they have different ideas about what they should do. And Hezbollah are much more powerful than Hamas. They've got it much bigger. They've got better weapons. I mean, Hezbollah look like a conventional army, and Hezbollah are running the country. They're part of a government, whereas Hamas are an organisation that, let's say, were elected once and are failing to run a very, very small territory. But they're both part of the Iranian sort of web of influence. And the difference is that the Iranians, they fund Hamas to about 70% of Hamas's income is from Iran, about 100 million a year. The thing about Hezbollah in Lebanon is that they basically do what Iran tells them. And if Hezbollah get involved, it will be because Iran has either told them to, or that Hezbollah have said, we have to get involved, and Iran has said, okay, they've agreed to it. But believe me, if Hezbollah get involved, then this becomes a very different crisis altogether. And it's possible because the danger is this whole thing spins out of control, and the Israelis may be facing a three-front war, one front in Gaza, one front in the north in Lebanon against Hezbollah, and a third front on the West Bank. If this provokes a third intifada, which is entirely plausible, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but if it does, then the Israelis will find themselves fighting a three-front war inside, as it were, their own neighborhood, with the Iranians on the outside, as it were, conducting the whole orchestra. Even if the Iranians don't quite want that role, they certainly don't at the moment, but they might find that they've got no alternative. And that's the real issue. And just to finish off this, Ian, sorry, there's already a lot of fighting on the northern front in Lebanon, but it's just about below the level of warfare. And because it's been sort of lost in the news, there are deaths every day in the West Bank. The West Bank, there are raids going on Palestinian territory, Palestinian areas every day. And every day people are getting killed on the West Bank. That would normally make the news, but it's not even making the news this week.
Just going back to Iran, Hassan has sent in this text. Is there any proof of Iran providing material assistance to Hamas, or is this an attempt to widen the conflict a la Iraq in 2003? I mean, somebody else, I can't find the text now, but somebody else suggested earlier that this was all grist to the mill for the United States because it could provide a pretext for action against Iran. I mean, I think that's slightly stretching it, but you never know.
No, I can promise you the United States wants this crisis like a hole in the head. The Biden administration, if you'd said to Joe Biden 2 weeks ago, what's the worst thing that can happen between now and the election, Joe, he'd have said, well, something like this, probably. I can promise you there is no sense that the US is behind this. Absolutely not. However, Iran is structurally involved with Hamas, for sure. As I say, they fund them. They do give them weapons. They give them a lot of small arms. They give them some missiles. For instance, they give them the Fatah 110, which is a short-range ballistic missile, and they supply Hezbollah with that missile. They won't supply the Russians with it. I mean, the Russians have been asking for the Fatah 110 since last year, and the Iranians, for reasons I won't go into, they will give them drones. They give the Russians drones, the Shahed 136, but they won't give them the Fatah 110, but they'll give that to Hamas.
Well, actually, just on this, Bob in Tunbridge Wells has got a question directly related to what you've just been talking about. Bob, this is your moment. Go ahead.
Hello, fellas.
Hi.
Yeah.
Well, what I can't understand, and it's not about this conflict, just this conflict gone, it's about previous conflicts throughout the Israeli-Palestinian troubles. Now, geographically, the structure of Gaza is on the coast, yes? A little strip on the coast.
Yeah.
Israel, the rest of it is surrounded by Israelis. There's only one way in to Gaza, and that's from the sea. What you mentioned about...
Well, not quite, because you've got the Egyptian border as well.
Okay. If you spoke about the American intelligence, British intelligence, and the Israeli intelligence, probably one of the most highly secured countries in the world. Okay, no one's ever mentioned. People say Iran is supplying them, blah blah blah, with Lebanon, because it's not Israel's. How do they get? Now they patrol the seas. the Israelis. So you get the medical stuff coming, your food, your building material, all that. That's all checked. How are they getting? How are Hamas in Gaza getting this amount of weaponry? Like in any conflicts of war, if you stop the supply line, it stops the battle, half of the battle. Now that tiny strip on the coastline is predominantly the way in. How do they get that amount of weaponry into Gaza without the so-called American intelligence, the British, the Israelis, not stopping that?
Good question.
Now, no one's ever spoken about it because...
Yeah, okay. Well, let Michael speak about it. Michael, how does that happen?
Yeah. So, three answers, Bob. One is infiltration from the south of Lebanon, because it's possible because of the normal comings and goings of people, farmers, and so on. It's possible to smuggle stuff in, which they do. Secondly, is the coast itself. Again, it's very hard for the Israelis to check all of the coast all of the time, although they certainly try. But the biggest way, the third way, is tunnels. All right, the Rafah crossing is the crossing between Egypt and Gaza, the one in the south. But it is honeycombed with tunnels. One of the things that Hamas have become very good at is building tunnels. And these tunnels are big enough to take 4x4s, right? They will take big vehicles. They're not just there's not like escape tunnels like the Great Escape, all on little trolleys. These are big tunnels. They're very good at engineering that. And the Israelis have logged more than 1,300 tunnels since 2007 that have been built. Now, the Israelis blow these up when they find them, when they can, and they try to log them. But the Hamas themselves have been incredibly clever at building tunnels, and a lot of them seem to come from the Egyptian side. Not all of them around Rafah, because then they could locate them. But along that coast, that Egyptian border is only about 6 miles wide from the Mediterranean to the edge of Gaza. It's about 6 miles wide and 30 miles long. That's the strip. That's Gaza. And so, but in that 6 miles, the honeycomb of tunnels is, I'm told, something that you wouldn't believe. And then the fourth thing, I suppose I should say, is that the Iranians are pretty good at making their own missiles. So the Qasem missile, which they've got 4 or 5 versions of now, that's entirely homemade. So it's made out of old piping, so a bit of plumbing piping, potassium nitrate and sugar. Famous device is the fuel, and a bit of commercial explosives in the nose. The issue then is how to make it actually go off, the detonator. That's the clever bit. But essentially, potassium nitrate and fuel, potassium nitrate and sugar for the fuel, plumbing piping for the body, a couple of fins on the end. They don't have to be accurate. They simply have to go a couple of miles to be on the Israeli side of the border. And remember, Jerusalem itself is only 48 miles away from Gaza. So once these things have been perfected, which they have, they can reach Jerusalem with these very inaccurate missiles. And these missiles don't do a lot of damage in Israel. But of course, they worry the Israelis, quite rightly, because they could fall anywhere.
More questions to come. Bob, thank you for yours. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32 News Headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Palestinian officials say more than 1,400 people, including almost 450 children, have died in Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. In Israel, 1,300 people have been killed since Hamas's attack last weekend. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, says a Royal Navy task force will be sent to the Eastern Mediterranean to support humanitarian efforts. It's part of a military plan to support Israel and stop escalation in the region. And 3 Jewish schools in North London have closed to protect their students. It's as one charity's reported a 300% rise in anti-Semitism cases. LBC weather, rain affecting much of England and Wales tonight, some of it heavy. Showers for southern Scotland and Northern Ireland and a low of 7 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:35. Sometimes I really have to shake my head in disbelief at some of the texts and emails I get on this programme. And here's one from Simon. It's headed, "Are you..." Well, there's lots of asterisks, and then it says crazy. It says, "Hi, Iain." Starts off friendly enough. "We have a massive increase of 300% on a tax on Jewish people in Britain. So you think it's a good idea to bring Palestinians here? Are you crazy, Iain? Why are idiots trying to import the world's problems and bring them here?" Could you just point out, when have I suggested that we should bring the entire Palestinian population to this country? I said British citizens might be located in Gaza, and they have every right to come here. They are British citizens. They have British passports. But don't try and make things up, and don't try and imagine what you think I've said when I haven't said it. Thank you very much indeed. Michael Clarke is here, Defence and Foreign Affairs analyst, taking your calls. Lots of them coming in. Let's go to Aziz, who's in Ealing. Aziz, hi.
Hello there. Thanks for taking my call.
What would you like to ask?
I wanted to ask if there can be a just settlement and a lasting peace. And I know there's a lot of hatred right now, but then, in Northern Ireland, there was a lot of hatred, and it seemed like it would never end, but it did. Also, after the Second World War, when we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, and the hatred between the Brits, the French, and the Germans. But now it's non-existent. It melted away, but you need a just resolution for everybody to make that happen. And what are the chances of something like that happening? Michael?
Yeah, Aziz, you're absolutely right. Peace can be made, and the examples you give there are very good ones. It's generational. What happens is that you have one or two or maybe three generations who cannot make peace, who hate each other for all sorts of reasons, good or bad, or good and bad usually. And when you get to the fourth and fifth and sixth generations, people turn around and say, do we really want to keep doing this? Have we not got better interests in economic cooperation, blah, blah, blah. And that's what's said. And of course, there's always been some bright spots in what's happened in the Middle East since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, but really it goes back to the British Mandate in the late 1930s and arguably to the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So, there's been a problem for now, let's say, over 120 odd years, which has become very, very acute. But at some times, as we had, peace between Egypt and Israel after 1973, 1975, I think that was, Henry Kissinger, who's just turned 100, incidentally, this year. He negotiated it, won the Peace Prize for it. We had some peace in the Oslo Accords of 1993, which looked as if they'd set up a roadmap. And in recent years, it's all drifted away because the two-state solution, which is what everybody agrees is the best idea at the moment, so that there is a separate Palestinian state beside the Israeli state, and you can argue about, which bits of territory belong where, and that's obviously the problem. But that's never been implemented. The two-state solution, everyone agrees is the best idea, but in truth, Israel has stopped really trying for a two-state solution in recent years, and the Palestinians have taken themselves off the front line of the argument because they're very badly represented by Fatah. It used to be said that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the Palestinians in general, their leadership, they say they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They've drifted in a pretty corrupt way, to be honest. And so it's very depressing where we are now. But like you, I think, I never lose my faith in the idea that generationally, enough has happened in the past, and something was happening with what was called the Abraham Accords, which were developing. I mean, you've got to give the Trump administration and Kushner some credit here. They got the Abraham Accords going, and they did look as if they might begin to create a new reality. But again, the opportunity has been lost, mainly, I think, by Netanyahu in the Abraham Accords, because he didn't take Palestinian rights and responsibility seriously enough. He thought he could have the Abraham Accords without dealing with the Palestinian question. Well, you can't, and that's what this crisis is indicating. So, yeah, I'm depressed at the moment, but in the long term, I'm an optimist. I always say I'm a short-term pessimist because I'm paid to be as an analyst, but I'm a long-term optimist because I am. And I think generationally, there are things we can hope for, but we have to get through this next phase And we have to have the sense of the international community leaning on all the participants to look for a better future out of all of this as soon as possible. That's mealy-mouthed words, I'm afraid, because the prospect at the moment are very bleak. But they will change. Nothing lasts forever.
I have never, ever disagreed with you before, but I'm going to risk it now. Wasn't it Sadat and Begin and Carter, the Camp David agreements, rather than Henry Kissinger in the 1970s?
Sorry, no, Kissinger. Yeah, all right. I beg your pardon. No, go on. You're right. Kissinger created the peace after the Yom Kippur War.
Right.
And he created that momentum.
Yeah.
And then it was Begin and Sadat, who, of course, both were assassinated because of it. I'm sorry, you are right, Ian. I'm sorry.
I feel my work here is done, and I can go home for the week now.
Right, but that was very interesting because very tragic. But Begin and Sadat were both assassinated because of the peace that they arrived at by their extremists on both of their sides. It just shows the price they paid in terms of their own communities by making peace when they did.
Now, Shahid says, can you ask Michael about how credible he thinks the stories of babies being beheaded are?
Yeah, that's interesting because it was one officer said that they had seen the remains of a beheaded baby. Now, that might be true, but that immediately then became babies have been beheaded, and it went around the world as a story. And it hasn't been stood up so far as of tonight, I think, except by that one statement. So it might turn out to be true, but it wouldn't altogether surprise me if it isn't true, because it's only got one source. And all good journalists will know, and Ian will know very well, that you go for three sources always. If you're going to stand something up, as they say in the newsroom, you need three sources, and they've all got to be different. And this is one source, and a lot of news organizations ran with that, and they really shouldn't have. And I have to say, I do some work for Sky these days. Sky wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't touch it as a news item until they could stand it up.
It's interesting because there have been pictures sent out which I will admit I have refused to look at over the course of this evening of dead babies. I just can't. But they have been verified. But it is true to say that the heads are not beheaded. But just the fact that there are dead babies is,
bad enough.
It is bad enough, and of course there will have been babies who've died through the Israeli bombings of Gaza as well. We should acknowledge that. Aziz, thank you very much indeed, and Shahid. Let's go to Ali in Doncaster. Ali, hello.
Yeah, hello there, mate. How are you?
I think I'm getting a cold. I always do after party conferences, but that's too much information. What would you like to ask, Ali?
Yeah, I just quickly want to reiterate what you just said there about the babies. That was I think it was a journalist or a soldier that told a journalist that he or she seen this, etc., etc., and that journalist or reporter or whatever soldier put it on Twitter, and then obviously it was saying, oh yeah, I've never seen nothing like that kind of thing. Basically, it's a propaganda. But anyway, coming back to why I called initially, the Israeli Prime Minister yesterday said on national TV in Israel that all Palestinians should leave Gaza. Where are they supposed to go? There's a cubicle of like a prison, 2 million people there. 50% of them are 16 to 18-year-olds. And then on the same term, the Israel army bombed the Egypt corridor border for no access for Palestinians to even try to cross to Egypt. So where are they supposed to go?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Ali. There are 2.3 million people in Gaza. There is no way out. All the crossing points, there are 5 crossing points on the land side of Israel, 4 crossing points on the land side of Israel, and then the Rafah crossing into Egypt. Those are the main ones. And they're all closed at the moment. And even if the Rafah crossing had not been closed because of explosions taking place around there, the Egyptians always say that, well, you can go across Rafah, but there's paperwork and you've got to have a visa before you can cross. You can't just turn up as a refugee and so on.
Exactly. I agree with you.
So there's no way out.
What Israel done is to bomb that crossing that you've just mentioned, and that's where Egypt have objected to it, saying, "Oh, why did you do that for?" kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are some more open areas in Gaza than others. I mean, Gaza City is extremely dense and so on, and the neighborhoods around Gaza City are. But up in the north and then in the south, in Khan Yunis, there's a bit more open ground, and people could try to go there and just get out of the way of the urbanized areas. But I mean, these people got nothing, and there's a lot of people within the urban areas are now moving around. You can see the accounts of many of them saying, "Well, this is my fourth place now in 3 days, and I keep having to move because the building next door is bombed or whatever it might be." And so, at least the UN said that now there are at least, I think the last figure was almost 700,000 Gazans are displaced from their homes, and there were 300,000 in schools and hospitals. They'd gone to the schools, gone to the hospitals, just to sit there on the assumption that the Israelis won't deliberately bomb schools and hospitals, and they won't. The Israelis are not the Russians. They will not bomb schools and hospitals, and so people are crowding into those areas. But of course, if they've got no food or water or fuel or power, these people are going to be in a desperate state. And the blockade which is now taking place in Israel, I'm fairly sure will be causing, multiple deaths by this time next week for sure, if it's not lifted.
Ali, thank you very much for that. We'll have more from Michael in just a moment. It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Now Israel declares the territory around Gaza a closed military zone. Former British Ambassador Mark Regev, who's now senior advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
We will dismantle the Hamas organization. Gaza will be different when this is over. But this is not another round of fighting. This is war.
How does denying Palestinians water, power make the situation right?
They have attacked us brutally. They expect business as usual. There are consequences for such behavior.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Michael Clarke is here taking your calls. Let's go to Christoph in Wembley Park. Hello, Christoph.
Hi there. But can I just mention before I ask my question? Aziz was talking about a peaceful solution, and I'd just like to mention something which Professor Clarke didn't, which is that the Second World War only ended with 2 unconditional surrenders. But my question is this: normally in a hostage situation, there are sort of 3 interested parties. There are hostages, the hostage takers, and the negotiators. Here we have at least 2 more. That's the civilian population of Gaza and the foreign governments whose citizens are hostages. So how can this possibly end well?
You're absolutely right, Christoph. It's a really difficult one, and Israel has never faced a hostage crisis of this magnitude before. Apparently 150 people now, or something approaching that, dispersed around the Gazan territory, and they don't know where they all are. There's limited scope for what negotiation might achieve, and that one of the things that the Israelis are saying about this blockade, Israel Katz, who's the energy minister, said today, we're not going to turn anything on, we're not going to throw a single switch unless all our hostages are returned unharmed, and that's the demand. And I don't think that will have very much effect, but you never know. It might suddenly begin a process. There's also the Qatar government was very inventive, I thought, about 48 hours ago. And they said, look, there are women and children held in Israeli jails, Palestinian women and children in Israeli jails, and there are women and children among hostages. Why don't we at least exchange the women and children? And that might get some sort of process going. There's quite a lot of support for that. But in present circumstances, it's not likely to happen. And so given that the Israelis are not going to be deterred by the presence of the hostages from moving in on Gaza, I'm certain about that. They might delay it if they think there's something to be gained, but I'm sure they won't be deterred from doing it. And if they delay, it will only be a matter of a day or 2 days. They won't delay for 2 weeks for negotiations to take place, or a month, or anything like that. I think the outlook for the hostages is extremely bleak, and I wish that were not true, but I'm afraid it is. And this is pretty well the biggest hostage crisis, the most dramatic hostage crisis that we can think of. And it occurred to me, this is the most dirty sort of politics. One side has taken hostages and is threatening to kill them on a regular basis. And the other side is blockading the territory such as to create quite a lot of deaths in the next few days unless the hostages are returned. Politics doesn't get much dirtier than this.
Christoph, thank you. Text question from Abraham. Doesn't it seem like a proxy war of the US to Iran, with Israel and Hamas fighting for them?
No, it doesn't, for the reasons I mentioned before. The Americans, need this like a hole in the head. And the Americans want to get back to the deal, the nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, as it was called, the Joint Program on Armaments. And the nuclear deal to freeze Iran's nuclear program was concluded by President Obama in 2015 and then cancelled by President Trump. And that's put the whole thing into abeyance. And the Iranians now, as a result of the cancellation of that deal, are now on the verge of a nuclear weapon, the very verge of it. They could go nuclear in a matter of months from where they are now. And thank you for that, President Trump. So the Americans don't want to get into a bigger row with the Iranians if they can avoid it. They still want to try to cool it with Iran and see if they can keep Iran below the nuclear threshold. And they certainly are not trying to manipulate this crisis, as it were, to get back into the Middle East. Believe me, the Americans, had their fingers sufficiently burned in Iraq not to want to do it again for the foreseeable future. And I don't think we'll see the Americans get involved in that sort of military operation for the next 40 or 50 years, if ever.
Yusuf in Croydon says, could you ask Michael what his view is on what Turkey's role might be going forward? We all know that President Erdogan has a tendency to be rather idiosyncratic in his attitudes towards foreign governments. What are Michael's predictions as to what he's likely to do? A lot of people think that's a weird question but Turkey has actually in the past had a bit of a pivotal role to play. It's been quite close, I think, to sort of the starting its own peace process.
Yes, it has. Yusuf, you're absolutely right. I mean, President Erdogan is impossible to second guess what he thinks he wants to do, except that he wants to stride the world stage. He wants to be a big shot in world politics. And Turkey is a really important country because it straddles the Middle East. Think about the old Ottoman Empire, Europe and Western Asia, and the Caucasus. And so the Turkic peoples are one of the great peoples of our civilizations. And you're absolutely right that Turkey is actually trying to play a bit of a mediating role here. There are three countries in the region who are now really working very hard. One is tiny little Qatar, another is Turkey, pretty big Turkey, and the third one is Egypt. President Sisi of Egypt, terrible military dictator presiding over a really nasty regime. But here he is, acting in a constructive way in this particular crisis, because he's really worried about a war that Israel may get involved in that would draw Egypt into it. And so Turkey, along with Qatar and Egypt, are playing quite a big role. They're talking to the United States all the time. Turkey can talk to Israel in different sorts of ways. Erdogan's had on-off relations with Netanyahu, but he is listened to. And Turkey does have a role to play, if only because it's got natural interests in the Middle East. That's the Turkic peoples, it's the Ottoman Empire. Turkey is a popular country in lots of parts of the Middle East, not in Syria, I have to say, but in other parts of the Middle East, Turkey is pretty popular.
There are also back channels that go on between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. I mean, it'd be fascinating to be a fly on the wall there at the moment, wouldn't it? But and that's where I'm quite depressed about the possibility for peace, because I just don't think the Palestinian Authority has got the authority that maybe at one time it had, because of the weak leadership that's been displayed over the past few years.
Yeah, exactly right. Nobody speaks effectively for the Palestinians, either in the West Bank or in Gaza. And so you've got these millions of people who are they are the great losers of modern world politics. The world always leaves the Palestinians out of pretty well everything. And they're very poor at representing themselves. And so you've got to ask yourself, if you and I believe ultimately, we get the leaderships we deserve over the long run, you get the leadership you deserve. And so why is it that the poor Palestinians for the last 50 years have deserved such rotten leadership? But sadly they have. And I wish that could change.
Danny in Marlow, who's got quite a long text here, I won't read it out, but it is essentially saying, aren't we taking the eye off the ball with Ukraine over the past few days? And this often happens when you have one big international crisis, then gets usurped by another one. Think of Suez 1956 and Russia's invasion of Hungary. Putin is laughing his socks off at this, isn't he? It plays into his hands.
Yes, and the Russian press this morning, which I say I only read in translation, but the Russian press this morning was saying exactly that this is quite a constructive move because it will distract the Americans. It'll mean the Americans are trying to supply two allies with arms at once, both Israel and Ukraine. And interestingly, since Saturday, the Russians have stepped up their offensives all the way along the front. There's a 1,000-kilometer front, 600 miles, and the Russians are attacking all the way along the front in local heavy attacks. They've obviously been told from the top to really push now that the world's attention is somewhere else. And you're right. We have taken our eyes off the ball. I haven't, because I live with Ukraine on a daily basis. And this is just another, I'm looking at Gaza as well. But I've spent the last 2 years looking at Ukraine on a daily basis, and this is not good for the nature of the war in Ukraine. It's not good for Kiev, what's happening in Gaza, and indeed there's lots of Russian stories kicking around. There's even a fake BBC website piece, and it looked pretty good, but it was a complete fake that the Russians put out. A BBC purportedly report that Ukraine had supplied Hamas with weapons. Completely untrue and not even credible. Ukraine needs all the weapons it can get hold of. The idea that it's sending it to Hamas is ridiculous. But again, it gives the Russians the opportunity to put a bit of fake propaganda out there to show that Ukraine actually is making common cause with the terrorists.
Well,
totally untrue.
You're certainly not taking your eye off the ball in Ukraine, nor will we. We will be covering it more. Danny, thanks for that. And Michael, thank you for spending the last hour with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've really educated us on a lot of the aspects of this, which I think some of us struggle struggle with sometimes. That's Michael Clarke, Defence and Foreign Affairs analyst. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to be talking about the cowardice of the Football Association. They have banned Israeli flags at the forthcoming England International, and they will not light up the Wembley Arch with the colours of the Israeli flag. Why do you think the FA is showing such cowardice? They were quite happy to have the Ukrainian colours on the Wembley Arch. They were quite happy to have Black Lives Matter movement colours on the Wembley Arch. So why not the Israeli flag? Draw your own conclusions. 0345 6060 973. But we'll take calls on the wider conflict as well during the course of the next 60 minutes.